Working the night shift at the convenience store was supposed to be boring, quiet, uneventful, and a paycheck at the end of the week. My manager, Dan, had handed me the keys 2 weeks ago with a chuckle, saying, "You'll meet all sorts, Jack. Just keep the coffee pot full and the doors locked after midnight. Oh, and if anything weird happens, don't play hero, call me or the cops." I thought he was being overly cautious. After all, this wasn't the rough part of town. But by the time the clock struck 2 a.m. last Friday, I realized Dan had left out some important details. The store sat on the edge of town, surrounded by stretches of dense forest. The nearest neighbor was a 24-hour diner half a mile down the road, and beyond that, nothing but darkness. I was halfway through restocking the chips aisle when the automatic door whooshed open. I peeked around the corner, expecting another late-night trucker or someone desperate for caffeine. Instead, a man stood there, tall, wiry, with a sunken face that seemed too pale under the flickering fluorescent lights. He didn't move, just stood in the doorway, staring at me. His eyes, there was something wrong with them. They weren't glazed like a drunk's or dilated like a junkie's. They were too dark, like they swallowed all the light around them. "Hey, buddy, we're closed," I said, my voice echoing in the empty store. I took a cautious step toward the counter, closer to the silent panic button Dan had shown me on my first day. The man didn't reply. Instead, he took a single step inside, his bare feet slapping against the tiled floor. That's when I noticed his clothes. Rags, torn and filthy, but they weren't modern. They looked old, like something out of a black and white photograph. And he was wet, not just damp, but dripping, as if he'd walked out of a lake moments ago. "Do you need help?" I tried again, my voice wavering. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 2:03 a.m. The seconds seemed to drag. The man raised a hand, his fingers bony and unnaturally long. He pointed to the back of the store, toward the storeroom door. "Nope," I said out loud, shaking my head. "You need to leave." For a moment, he just stared, and then, without a sound, he turned and walked down the aisle. He wasn't heading to the storeroom but toward the back wall, where the security cameras were mounted. I hurried behind the counter and grabbed the phone, ready to call Dan or the police. But when I looked up at the monitors, my blood turned cold. The cameras showed nothing. The man wasn't there. My heart pounded as I scanned the aisles, but the screens displayed an empty store. Yet, I could still hear the faint slap of wet footsteps, echoing closer and closer. That's when I remembered Dan's parting words. "Don't play hero." I stayed frozen behind the counter, the receiver of the landline phone trembling in my hand. My eyes darted between the empty aisles on the security monitor and the sound of wet footsteps slapping closer. I told myself it was some kind of glitch, an old system acting up. But my gut said otherwise. Something wrong was walking around the store. "Leave now," I yelled, gripping the phone like a lifeline. My voice sounded stronger than I felt. "I'm calling the cops." The footsteps stopped. I squinted at the monitors, heart hammering. And then I saw him, standing directly beneath one of the cameras in aisle 4, staring straight up into the lens. But on the screen, nothing. My stomach churned as he tilted his head toward me. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his arm and pointed again, this time at me. Then he turned, still dripping, and walked straight toward the storeroom door. Screw the cops. I was about to bolt. My car keys were under the counter, and I calculated I could be out the door and on the road in less than 20 seconds. Whatever this was, it wasn't my problem. And then the lights flickered. One by one, the bulbs overhead began to hum and buzz before plunging into darkness. The emergency lights kicked in, bathing the store in a dim, reddish glow. The monitors blinked out, and for the first time, the store fell completely silent. No footsteps, no hum of the refrigerators, just the sound of my own breathing. I grabbed my phone, fumbling with the screen to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course, the woods surrounding the store always made reception spotty. "Dan, please answer," I whispered, hitting speed dial. The line rang once, twice, and then it cut out with an ear-splitting static that made me drop the phone. "Damn it," I hissed, crouching behind the counter. I wasn't sticking around to see how this ended. The emergency flashlight was mounted beneath the register, and I yanked it free, shining it toward the back of the store. Aisles of snacks and drinks stretched out like empty corridors, nothing out of place. Until I saw the storeroom door. It was wide open. That door had been locked. I checked it myself after stocking earlier. The storeroom didn't even have an exterior exit, just a concrete room packed with shelves, boxes, and one very creepy mop bucket. My knees felt weak as I stood, flashlight trembling in my grip. I didn't want to look, but I also didn't want to be ambushed by some lunatic hiding in there. I stepped out from behind the counter, keeping my back to the wall as I edged toward the storeroom. The flashlight beam jittered across the tiles, illuminating the scattered debris of an overturned display. "Hello!" My voice barely sounded like mine, thin and strained. "If you're still here, I'm calling the cops." I reached the door, heart pounding in my ears. The storeroom was pitch black inside, the emergency lights not quite reaching beyond the threshold. Taking a deep breath, I shone the flashlight into the room. Empty. Boxes lined the walls, stacked neatly just as I'd left them. The mop bucket stood untouched in the corner. I sagged in relief, lowering the flashlight for just a second. And then I heard it, a soft, wet slap. Behind me, I spun around, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly across the aisles. My breath hitched as I saw him, standing in the middle of the store, dripping, staring at me with those endless dark eyes. And he wasn't alone. 3 more figures stood behind him, pale and wet, their faces eerily blank. All of them pointed at me in unison, their movements slow and deliberate. My stomach clenched as the first man stepped forward, his wet footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. He reached out a hand, and I swear I could hear my pulse pounding in the stillness. That's when the refrigerator doors started to slam. One by one, they banged open and shut, the glass rattling as if something inside was trying to escape. And then, they all stopped. Silence again. The man tilted his head, his hand still outstretched toward me. And in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, he said, "You shouldn't have looked." My breath hitched at his words. "You shouldn't have looked." They echoed in my head, soft and raspy, but clear enough to pierce the terror fogging my brain. I gripped the flashlight tighter, the beam trembling as I pointed it at the 4 figures. They didn't flinch, didn't react. They just stood there, staring, their clothes dripping onto the floor in rhythmic little plinks. "You need to leave." My voice cracked as I backed toward the counter, bumping into the shelves of candy. "I'm calling the cops." The man in front, the one who first appeared, tilted his head, almost curiously. Then he took another step forward, his bare, wet feet squelching against the tile. The 3 others followed in unison, their movements jerky, almost puppet-like. "Nope," I muttered under my breath. My fingers darted to the silent alarm button under the counter. I pressed it hard, praying it worked. They stopped moving. The man in front lowered his hand, his lips parting into a smile. It was too wide, stretching unnaturally across his pale face. "They won't come," he said softly. My skin prickled. "Who won't come?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled something out, a crumpled, waterlogged piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, the soggy edges tearing slightly, and held it out to me. "Take it," he said. I didn't move. My legs felt rooted to the spot. "No," his smile faded. "Take it or they'll take you." The 3 figures behind him all stepped forward, their feet moving in unison, their blank faces suddenly twisting into something far worse. Grins, but not smiles. Teeth bared, lips stretched unnaturally thin, their expressions filled with something primal and hungry. My shaking hand darted out, snatching the paper from him. It felt cold and slimy, like it had been soaking in a swamp. I unfolded it slowly, the flashlight beam casting a dim glow over what looked like a list. "Rules: do not look at them in the cameras. Do not speak to them directly. If they leave the storeroom, lock the doors. If they reach you, you will not survive. If you take the paper, you must play the game. You cannot leave the store until 6 a.m. My mouth went dry. What the hell is this? The man tilted his head again, that horrible grin returning. Your instructions. I stared at the list, the words swimming in and out of focus. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I glanced at the clock above the counter. It read 2:43 a.m., over 3 hours to go. This is some kind of sick joke, I hissed, backing further behind the counter. No joke, he whispered. You shouldn't have looked. As if on cue, the store lights flickered again, the emergency lights dimming almost to nothing. The 3 figures behind him began to move, spreading out across the aisles. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like predators circling prey. You can't leave, the man said again, stepping closer to the counter. His voice was calm, almost kind. But you can survive if you follow the rules. My mind raced, trying to think of an escape. The front door? No, I'd have to get past them. The storeroom? A dead end. I looked at the paper again, the last rule burning into my brain. You cannot leave the store until 6 a.m. What happens at 6 o'clock? I asked, my voice trembling. He smiled wider. You'll see. I shoved the paper into my pocket and grabbed the metal bat we kept under the counter. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. If you think I'm just going to stand here... The man's face suddenly twisted, his grin vanishing. His eyes narrowed, and he said, in a voice so sharp it felt like a slap, if you break the rules, it's over. The lights flickered again, plunging the store into near-total darkness. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, but it only illuminated empty shelves and scattered shadows. The man and his companions were gone. My pulse raced as I scanned the store, my knuckles white around the bat. Somewhere, in the distance, I heard the faint sound of dripping water. And then, from the far end of the store, a soft, sing-song voice whispered, "Ready or not, here we come." The voice echoed through the store, stretching and twisting in the darkness. It wasn't coming from one place, it was everywhere. My stomach churned as I gripped the bat tighter, the flashlight beam jerking across the aisles. I forced myself to focus, stick to the rules. The paper was still in my pocket, soggy and cold. I pulled it out, my breath catching on the first line. Do not look at them in the cameras. My eyes darted to the blank security monitors. They hadn't flickered back on since the lights failed, but I wasn't taking chances. I ducked behind the counter, keeping my back pressed to the wall as I tried to steady my breathing. Jack? The voice cooed, drawing out my name. It was soft but wrong, like hearing your own voice distorted through static. The drip-drip of water grew louder, like someone wringing out a soaked cloth. My flashlight wobbled in my hand, the beam barely cutting through the heavy shadows. I know you're there, the voice continued, sing-song and mocking. We just want to play. Why don't you come out? I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay still. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything but that haunting voice. Then came the footsteps, wet and deliberate, slapping against the tile. They weren't like before. These were faster, more eager, circling the aisles as if they were searching. Stick to the rules. The second rule flashed in my head. Do not speak to them directly. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood, stifling the urge to scream. The sound of dripping grew louder, joined by the creak of shelves shifting under invisible weight. Someone was moving closer. The flashlight beam darted to the end of the counter, just in time to catch a pale, bony hand curling around the edge. My breath hitched as the hand gripped the counter, the fingers impossibly long, the nails cracked and blackened. Slowly, a head peeked around the corner, a blank, pale face with dark, bottomless eyes that stared directly at me. I clamped a hand over my mouth, fighting the scream clawing its way out. The figure tilted its head, its neck cracking loudly in the silence. You can't hide forever, it whispered. It didn't come closer. Instead, it backed away, moving with unnatural jerks and twitches. The sound of dripping water followed it, trailing off into the aisles. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, but then I saw the clock above the counter. 3:12 a.m. time was crawling, and I still had hours to go. The next rule blared in my head like a warning siren. If they leave the storeroom, lock the doors. The storeroom. I hadn't locked it. My chest tightened as I peeked over the counter, scanning the aisles. Shadows twisted and danced under the dim emergency lights, but the figures were gone. I crept toward the storeroom, clutching the bat in one hand and the flashlight in the other. The dripping sound had stopped, but the silence was worse. Felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The storeroom door loomed ahead, slightly ajar. My pulse thundered as I reached it, nudging it open with the tip of the bat. The room was empty, just rows of shelves and boxes stacked neatly against the walls. But the air inside was damp, and the floor glistened with small puddles of water. I shut the door quickly, fumbling with the key to lock it. My hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 tries to get the key into the lock. As soon as the door clicked shut, the lights flickered again, and the store was plunged into complete darkness. "Jack!" The voice was back, louder now, closer. It wasn't sing-song anymore, it was angry. I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly. The beam landed on one of the aisles, where all 4 figures stood, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their smiles were gone, replaced by blank, emotionless stares. They moved toward me in unison, their steps eerily silent now. I backed away, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Stay back," I shouted, forgetting the rule in my panic. They stopped. For a split second, I thought maybe I'd scared them off. And then the lead figure whispered, "You broke the rules." My blood ran cold as they started running. The sound of their feet hitting the tile was deafening, a chaotic cacophony of wet slaps and thuds. They moved faster than I thought possible, their limbs jerking unnaturally, closing the distance between us with horrifying speed. I turned and bolted down the nearest aisle, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my grip. The bat felt like dead weight, slowing me down as I sprinted for the back of the store. The storeroom was locked, but maybe I could barricade myself somewhere they couldn't reach. "Jack!" The voice was different now, layered, like all 4 of them were speaking at once. I chanced a glance over my shoulder and nearly tripped. They weren't running anymore. They stood at the end of the aisle, their heads tilted at impossible angles. Their eyes, those endless, black pits, glimmered faintly in the dim light, and their mouths moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. But I could feel them. A pressure built in my chest, heavy and oppressive, like the weight of their gaze was crushing me from the inside. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. Focus. The rules. I fumbled in my pocket for the crumpled paper, scanning the list with shaking hands. "If they reach you, you will not survive." No kidding. I shoved the paper back into my pocket and gripped the bat tighter. They hadn't moved yet, but I knew it wouldn't last. I darted into the next aisle, zigzagging toward the front of the store. The glass doors were just ahead, the parking lot beyond shrouded in darkness. Maybe I could make it to my car. But as I rounded the corner, my heart sank. The doors were gone. Where the glass panels had been, there was only a solid, featureless wall. No exit. No, no, no. I muttered, backing away. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Was this part of their game? A trap? The lights flickered again, and suddenly, they were closer. All 4 of them stood at the edge of the nearest aisle, their blank faces fixed on me. "You can't leave," they said in unison, their voices a chilling harmony. "You belong to us now." Panic clawed at my throat as I stumbled back, the bat slipping from my sweaty grip. I fell against the counter, knocking over a display of gum and lighters. My flashlight rolled away, plunging the store into near-total darkness. I scrambled for it, my fingers brushing the cold metal just as one of them lunged. A hand, bony and ice-cold, wrapped around my ankle, yanking me backward. I kicked wildly, my heel connecting with something solid. There was a sickening crunch and the grip loosened. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it around, the beam slicing through the dark. One of them was crouched on the floor, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. It let out a low, guttural hiss as it crawled toward me on all 4s. My legs moved before my brain could catch up. I scrambled to my feet and ran, ducking into the nearest aisle. The shelves loomed like narrow corridors, offering little comfort as the sound of dragging feet and guttural breaths grew louder behind me. You can survive if you follow the rules. The thought cut through the haze of panic. I hadn't broken all the rules yet. There was still a chance. I reached the end of the aisle and skidded to a stop, gasping for air. My eyes darted to the clock above the counter. 3:47 a.m. time was crawling. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. One of them stepped into view, their hollow eyes fixed on mine. Slowly, they raised a hand and pointed to the ceiling. I followed their gaze, the flashlight beam shaking as it climbed. Above me, the security cameras buzzed to life. The monitors behind the counter flickered on, each screen showing a different part of the store. But the images weren't of the store as it was now. They showed me. In every frame, I was running, hiding, panicking, but the angles were wrong. They weren't from the cameras. They were from their perspective, as if I were being watched through their eyes. I stumbled back, my breath hitching as the figures moved closer. Their movements were synchronized now, slow and deliberate, closing in from all sides. "You shouldn't have looked," the lead one whispered, its voice like shards of glass. They lunged as the flashlight flickered out, plunging me into darkness. The darkness was suffocating. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them closer, the air heavy with their presence. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out the faint sounds of dripping water and shuffling footsteps. I gripped the bat again, swinging wildly into the void. "Stay back!" My voice cracked, but I didn't care. Panic was clawing its way through my chest. Something cold grazed my shoulder, and I swung blindly. The bat connected with a sickening crunch, and a shriek pierced the darkness. It wasn't human, it was guttural, alien, like metal tearing. The sound receded, and for a brief moment, the oppressive weight lifted. The flashlight was still in my pocket. With shaking hands, I fumbled it out and smacked it against my thigh, praying it would work. The beam sputtered to life, weak but enough to illuminate the aisle ahead. They weren't there, but they weren't gone. The store seemed impossibly large now, the aisles stretching endlessly into the shadows. The clock above the counter glowed faintly in the distance. 4:07 a.m. time was crawling, each minute an eternity. The rules were burning in my mind, every word etched into my thoughts. If they reach you, you will not survive. You cannot leave the store until 6 a.m. The exit was still gone, replaced by that smooth, unbroken wall. The storeroom was locked. I was trapped, playing a game I didn't understand with rules that felt impossible to follow. A faint whisper broke the silence, a chorus of voices blending together. "Closer! Closer!" I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. At the far end of the aisle, they stood in a line, their pale faces gleaming in the faint light. Their eyes were different now. They weren't just dark. They were reflective, like pools of ink catching the glow of the flashlight. And they were locked on me. I backed away, the beam flickering as my grip on the flashlight tightened. "You can't win," the lead figure said softly, tilting its head. Its voice was layered, echoing like 100 whispers stacked on top of each other. "The rules aren't for you." I swallowed hard, my back pressing against the cold metal shelves. "What do you mean?" I blurted out, breaking the second rule. "Do not speak to them directly." The lead figure grinned, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. "You'll see." They moved faster this time, their jerky, unnatural strides closing the gap in seconds. I ducked under the shelves, crawling as fast as I could to the next aisle. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly, casting monstrous shadows across the walls. Somewhere above me, the security monitors buzzed to life again. This time, the screens showed something new. It wasn't the store. The images were of a forest, the camera panning through dense trees under the glow of a full moon. The perspective felt wrong, too low to the ground, as if whatever was holding the camera was crawling. Then the view shifted to a clearing, where something stood in the center. It was me. The image froze, my own terrified face staring back at me from the screen. My heart stopped as I realized the reflection behind me wasn't my own. They were there, standing in the clearing, their faces blank and lifeless. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and bat, and ran toward the counter. The rules didn't matter anymore. I just had to survive. The clock read 4:36 a.m. I had less than 90 minutes to go. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, their voices twisting into something that sounded like laughter. "You shouldn't have played?" I darted behind the counter, slamming the bat against the register to make noise, hoping to distract them. The whispers faltered for a moment, and I seized the chance to catch my breath. The paper was still in my pocket, soaked and torn. I pulled it out, scanning the rules again. And then I saw it, words I hadn't noticed before, scrawled faintly at the bottom of the page. At 5:59 a.m., the game changes. The faint words at the bottom of the page burned into my mind. At 5:59 a.m., the game changes. What did that mean? Would they stop? Would something worse happen? I didn't have time to think. The whispers were closing in again, rising and falling in a chaotic rhythm. They weren't speaking words anymore, just sounds, inhuman and chilling. The clock read 4:47 a.m. The minutes felt like they were stretching, each one heavier than the last. I clutched the bat and flashlight like lifelines, crouching behind the counter as the voices grew louder. The monitors flickered, showing flashes of the store, the forest, and my own face over and over again. And then silence. The sudden absence of sound was worse than the whispers. It was thick, pressing, as if the store itself was holding its breath. I strained my ears, waiting for something, anything. A single wet slap broke the stillness. I whipped the flashlight around, shining it toward the aisles. There was nothing. Another step, closer this time, echoed from the other end of the store. My stomach churned. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there, watching me. Stay calm. Think. The rules hadn't failed me yet, even if they were cryptic. I pulled the soggy paper from my pocket, reading it again, searching for anything I'd missed. My eyes darted to the first line. Do not look at them in the cameras. The cameras. I peeked over the counter at the monitors. They were still cycling through the strange images. Me in the forest, the dark aisles, the figures standing just out of view. If I could figure out how the cameras connected to them, maybe I could gain an edge. I crawled to the security console, fumbling with the buttons. The screens glitched, lines of static rippling across the monitors before settling on a live feed of the store. They were there. All four of them stood in the middle of the aisles, their heads tilted in unison, staring directly at the camera. My chest tightened as I fought the urge to turn away. Do not look at them in the cameras. But I had to know. I pressed a button to zoom in, the image sharpening. Their eyes, those endless, dark voids, seemed to pulse, drawing me in. I felt dizzy, like I was falling. And then, something moved behind them. It was faint, barely visible at first, but it was there. A shadow larger than any of them, stretching and shifting in the darkness. What the hell? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figures began to turn, one by one, their movements slow and deliberate. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at it. The shadow loomed larger, its edges writhing like smoke. For a moment it almost looked humanoid, arms, legs, a head, but it was wrong, twisted, and impossible. The monitors flickered, and the shadow moved. It didn't walk. It flowed, like ink spilling across the floor. The figures stood motionless as it consumed them, their pale forms dissolving into the darkness. My heart pounded as I backed away from the console, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The store was deathly silent again, the only sound my ragged breathing. The clock read 5:17 a.m. I sank to the floor, clutching the bat, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Were they gone? Or was this something worse? The rules hadn't said anything about shadows. A faint whisper broke the silence, softer than before but still sharp enough to send a chill down my spine. You're almost out of time. I swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing. The aisles were empty. The monitors were dark. The clock ticked on, 5:38 a.m. The minutes dragged, each one a battle against the oppressive silence. I didn't know what to expect when 5:59 came, but I knew I had to survive. I gripped the bat tighter, forcing myself to stand. If they came back, I'd be ready. And then the lights flickered one last time. The clock above the counter began to tick faster, the hands spinning wildly until they stopped. 5:59 a.m. The whisper returned, louder now, layered with 1,000 voices. The game changes. The clock froze at 5:59 a.m., and the air shifted. The oppressive silence was replaced by a low, steady hum that vibrated through the store, deep and guttural, like the growl of some massive, unseen beast. I stood frozen, clutching the bat, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The monitors flickered back to life, casting eerie, pale light across the counter. But the feeds had changed. The cameras no longer showed the aisles or the store. Instead, each screen displayed a different location. A playground under a moonlit sky, a stretch of highway shrouded in fog, a basement drenched in shadows. And in every frame there was movement. Figures, dozens of them, emerged from the darkness. They weren't like the ones I'd seen before. These were incomplete. Their bodies flickered, shifting between shapes, their edges blurred like static. The whispering began again, louder and more frantic. "You've played well?" the layered voice cooed, coming from everywhere at once. "But the rules were never for you." My chest tightened as the words sank in. What did they mean? Was this some sick game I'd never had a chance of winning? The hum grew louder, rattling the shelves, and the store began to change. The aisles stretched impossibly long, their ends disappearing into darkness. The shelves warped and twisted, their contents spilling onto the floor. The ceiling seemed to rise higher and higher until it was swallowed by shadow. I backed away, the bat slipping from my sweaty grip. My flashlight flickered weakly, the beam cutting through the unnatural gloom. The monitors continued to flicker, each screen showing the flickering figures inching closer to their respective cameras. And then, one by one, the feeds went dark. The hum stopped. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction. The store was silent again, but the silence wasn't empty. Something was here. The shadows around me deepened, crawling across the floor like liquid. I could feel it watching me, its gaze heavy and unrelenting. "You don't belong here," the voice hissed, and this time it sounded angry. A sound behind me made me whirl around. One of the shelves toppled over, crashing to the ground in a deafening roar. I stumbled back, falling against the counter as the shadows swirled closer. The clock above me ticked once, twice, and then it moved. 6 a.m. The hum returned, louder than ever, and the shadows stopped. From the darkness, a single figure emerged. It wasn't like the others. It was taller, its body impossibly thin and elongated, its face featureless except for a mouth that stretched too wide. Its movements were slow and deliberate as it stepped closer, the ground beneath its feet rippling like water. "You survived," it said, its voice a deep, resonant growl. "But survival has a cost." I scrambled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want?" I choked out, my voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, the mouth curling into a grotesque smile. "To play." Before I could react, it lunged. The shadows swallowed me whole, the store vanishing in an instant. I woke up outside, lying on the pavement under the pale light of the moon. The store was gone, replaced by an empty lot. My car was parked nearby, its engine running, as if I'd never gone inside. I staggered to my feet, my head pounding, my body aching. The crumpled paper was still in my pocket, the words smeared and unreadable. I checked my phone. The time read 6:13 a.m. The rules had let me survive, but something told me the game wasn't over. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that somewhere in the shadows they were still watching. For weeks, I tried to convince myself it was over. I went back to my normal routine, work, sleep, repeat, but the memory of that night refused to fade. Every time I passed the empty lot where the store had been, my skin prickled, and I had to fight the urge to floor the gas pedal. The lot was barren, the asphalt cracked and overgrown with weeds. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but I knew better. Something happened there, something I couldn't explain. I kept the crumpled paper with me, even though the ink had smeared beyond recognition. It was a reminder, though I wasn't sure of what, maybe a warning. It didn't help that the nightmares started almost immediately. I'd wake in a cold sweat, heart racing, unable to shake the vivid images from my mind. The store stretching into infinity, the figures with their blank faces and too wide smiles, and the shadow, always the shadow. But the worst part wasn't the dreams. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. Started small. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. Shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia. Trauma from the incident. Then one night I heard it again. The whisper. "You shouldn't have looked." I froze, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles turned white. The apartment was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the streetlights outside. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. I turned slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The living room was empty, but the shadows seemed darker, pooling unnaturally in the corners of the room. "Who's there?" My voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear. The shadows didn't move, but I felt it. The same heavy, oppressive presence from the store. I backed away, my mind racing. The paper. The rules. You cannot leave the store until 6 a.m. I followed the rules. I'd survived. But something was wrong. The lights flickered, and for a split second I saw it, the figure. Tall and thin with that too wide smile. It stood in the hallway, its featureless face staring directly at me. Then it was gone. The lights stabilized, and the apartment was empty again. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I called Dan. He didn't answer. I drove to his house, pounding on the door until his neighbor came out and told me Dan had moved away. No forwarding address. The store wasn't the only thing that had disappeared. The sightings became more frequent after that. I'd see them on the street at night, their blank faces staring from the shadows. In the reflection of a car window. In the crowd at the grocery store. They never got closer, but they didn't have to. The whispering followed me everywhere, growing louder with each passing day. And then, one night, I woke up at exactly 5:59 a.m. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. The clock on my nightstand ticked once, twice, then froze. The hum returned, rattling through the walls, the same sound that had haunted me in the store. And in the corner of my bedroom, the shadows began to move. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. They're getting closer, and I don't know the rules of this game anymore. But if you're reading this, take my advice. If you ever find yourself working the night shift, don't look too closely. Don't break the rules. And whatever you do, don't take the paper. Because once you're in the game, it never really ends. I couldn't outrun them anymore. No matter where I went, how fast I drove, or how brightly I lit my apartment, the shadows followed. Their presence was suffocating, always just out of reach but close enough to keep me on edge. I hadn't slept in days. The whispers came every night, growing louder, mocking me. They knew I was breaking down. And then one night I realized the truth. I was never supposed to survive. It started at 11:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because the clock on my wall started ticking backward, counting down instead of forward. The paper, the crumpled, smeared piece of paper I'd kept with me, was burning in my pocket, cold to the touch but radiating a weight I couldn't ignore. I pulled it out and unfolded it, my hands trembling. The words had returned. "You forgot the last rule." I stared at the paper, willing it to explain itself. A moment later, new words began to appear, scrawled in jagged, black lines that seemed to etch themselves into the damp surface. The game doesn't end until you finish it. The realization hit me like a freight train. All this time I thought I'd escaped, but I hadn't won. I'd only delayed the inevitable. The humming started again, low and rumbling, shaking the walls. The shadows in the room deepened, pooling under the furniture, stretching up the walls. "You're almost ready," the voices hissed, overlapping and layered, louder than ever. The paper slipped from my hands, fluttering to the floor. The words shifted again, morphing into a single, final sentence. "Return to the store." I didn't have a choice. The empty lot was as I remembered it, desolate, overgrown, abandoned. But as I stepped onto the cracked asphalt, the air shifted. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my chest, and the world around me seemed to blur. When I opened my eyes again, I was inside. The store was exactly as it had been that night, bright fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, rows of shelves stretching endlessly, the faint hum of the refrigerators. But it wasn't the same. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. And I wasn't alone. The figures stood in the center of the store, waiting. Their faces were blank, but their postures radiated anticipation, like they'd been expecting me. "You're here," the lead figure said, its voice calm and soft. "Are you ready to finish the game?" I clenched my fists, my heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, that too wide smile spreading across its face. "You already know." The shelves began to shake, the floor rumbling beneath my feet. The shadows moved like living things, writhing and reaching for me. "Choose," the figure said simply. "Choose what?" I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. The figure gestured to the counter. Behind it, the monitors flickered on, displaying the same warped images I'd seen before. The forest, the highway, the endless, stretching shadows. One screen stood out. It showed me, not a reflection, not a camera feed. Me standing in the middle of the store, staring at the monitors. "This is your game," the figure said. "You finish it, or it finishes you." I don't remember making the choice. One moment, I was staring at the monitors. The next, I was standing in the forest, the moonlight casting long shadows across the ground. The hum was gone, replaced by the sound of rustling leaves and distant whispers. I turned slowly, my breath hitching as I realized I wasn't alone. The figures surrounded me, their blank faces illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. They didn't speak this time. They didn't need to. The lead figure stepped forward, holding out its hand. "You can leave," it said softly, "but only if you take your place." I didn't understand at first, but as I looked around, it became clear. There had always been 4, and now there needed to be 5. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, the moonlight fading, the figures closing in, the overwhelming cold as the shadows swallowed me whole. When I woke up, I was standing in the empty lot again. But it wasn't empty anymore. The store was back, its fluorescent lights glowing faintly in the pre-dawn gloom. The sign above the door flickered to life, buzzing softly. And through the glass doors, I could see a new clerk standing behind the counter, looking nervous as they glanced at the clock. The time read 11:47 p.m. I smiled, my reflection in the glass grinning back at me with a face that wasn't quite my own. The game never ends. Not for me, and not for them.